Good morning. I want to invite everyone to take their seats. My name is Rabbi Lauren Holtzblatt, and it is my great honor to welcome you here to Addis, Israel, to our annual Garden of the Righteous program. This year is our 26th year of honoring heroes who stood for morality, human decency, risking their own lives to save Jews during the Shoah. As I stand up here today, our world is still in need of heroes, both regular citizens and recognized leaders alike, to stand up to a world on fire. 2 Saturdays ago, word spread across the world that innocent men, women, and children had been gassed by the Syrian government in the suburb of Douma, a suburb where journalists, aid workers, and investigators have been kept out, scenes that have felt entirely too familiar to our people. It is moments like these for us to come together, where the lessons of the Shoah, the silence of the world for too long, beg us to use our voices and our moral courage to speak out against the atrocities that continue to plague our world. It is moments like these that we need to find the courage to act by learning from the heroes who so bravely acted against the barbaric plans and actions of the leaders of their time. It is moments like these when we come together to honor heroes that we are reminded of the ways that we too can be heroes. It is moments like these that led this very congregation to adopt a Syrian family 1 year ago, to lovingly welcome them into our Addis family and guide them toward adopting to a new life in America. We come together today both to recognize the extraordinary leadership of Captain Gustav Schroeder of the St. Louis and to learn from his courage so we too can be courageous in our world. Before I give an intro to Captain Schroeder, we have many people to thank for today's program. First, I want to mention and thank Mrs. Huberta von Voss-Wittig, representing the Embassy of Germany, Adam Imawar, who is the artistic director of Theater J, Kevin Place, the associate producer of Theater J, Jose Carrasquillo, who is the director of Sotto Voce, which we will so amazingly see a scene from this morning, and the cast of Sotto Voce, Naomi Jacobson, Andre Tolero, and Desiree Marie Velez. Thank you for being here. We are honored to hear this morning from Dr. Hans Fischer and Mrs. Eva Wiener, who is the youngest passenger of the St. Louis. We want to acknowledge the Buff family, Fred Buff, Zichrono Livracha, who is a member of Addis Israel, who was a passenger as well in the St. Louis, and his widow is here with us today, along with his family. I want to acknowledge Cantor Ariane Brown, who we will be hearing from later today, George Peachy and Hazamir DC, the International Jewish Teen Choir, teens from our high school, our Ma'alot class, and Rabbi Kerith Rosenbaum, Mark Hetfield, who is the president and CEO of HIAS, who is with us here today, and of course, Judy Strauch, who was chair of the Garden of the Righteous Committee for many, many years and devoted countless hours, opened her home, did so much to keep this program going, and we want to thank you for being here. We remember all of our past honorees who, if you turn your program to the back, you will see all of their names. We are honored to welcome back the daughter and grandson of Jaap Penrat, our 2006 Garden of the Righteous honoree, and Noelle Penrat and her son Sam. We would like to thank heartfelt thanks to our Garden of the Righteous Committee. All of their names are listed on the back of your program, and Betty Adler, who is on our committee, who is a loving member of our community and also happens to be our photographer today. And special, special thanks to Burl Saltman, who is an extraordinaire in the rabbinic office. This program would not happen without Burl. and her loving devotion, as well as Courtney Tisch for helping to put this program together. We thank our sponsors, the Peter Dreyer Memorial Fund, the Scott Dreyer Fund, and the Ryna Cohen and Melvin Cohen Senior Rabbi Program Fund. I want to thank Reverend Thomas Bowen, who is here today, the Director of Office of Religious Affairs of the Mayor's Office. Thank you for being here. A few more. We have so many great people here today. Our President, Ricky Gerger, our Executive Director, David Polanski, Carol Klein and Gail Madison from our team, Rich Webster, Brina Sroor, Keith Dorset, who is on the sound today, and to our wonderful maintenance staff who make everything at Addis possible. Captain Schroeder set sail from Hamburg, Germany to Havana, Cuba, with more than 900 Jewish passengers aboard. When the St. Louis arrived in Havana on May 27, 1939, only 22 Jewish passengers with valid U.S. visas were allowed to disembark. The others were refused entry. The ship was forced to turn back to Europe. However, knowing that his passengers risked being arrested if they returned to Germany, Captain Schroeder decided not to head straight back to the German harbor. He even went so far as to develop a contingency plan by which the St. Louis was to be spectacularly shipwrecked near the English coast to force the British authorities to take some action. Refusing to return to Germany until he had found a safe haven for his Jewish passengers, the captain stalled on the voyage back, taking a route so close to Florida that the passengers could see the lights of Miami, in the hope that the United States would agree to let the desperate Jewish refugees land. Some St. Louis passengers cabled President Franklin D. Roosevelt asking for refuge, but the State Department and the White House had decided to take extraordinary measures to permit the refugees to enter, had decided not to allow them to enter. Following the U.S. government's refusal to permit the passengers to disembark, the St. Louis sailed back to Europe on June 6, 1939, but the passengers did not return to Germany. Jewish organizations, particularly the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, negotiated with 4 European governments to secure entry visas, and the passengers were allowed to disembark in Antwerp. Great Britain took 288 passengers, the Netherlands admitted 181 passengers, Belgium took 214 passengers, and 224 passengers found at least temporary refuge in France. Captain Schroeder was known to have allowed Jewish ritual observance on the ship and created a culture of dignity and respect. Thanks to Captain Schroeder's courage and determination not to abandon his Jewish passengers, many of them were able to escape the Nazis. On March 11, 1993, Yad Vashem recognized Captain Gustav Schroeder as a righteous among the nations, and we are honored to do the same here today. We are going to now run a short video, and then we will begin the rest of the program. Thank you for joining us.
In 1939, Captain Gustav Schroeder attempted to save just over 900 Jewish refugees from the horrors of Nazi Germany. Since 1933, the Nazis had been establishing a vast network of concentration camps and ghettos, setting the stage for the deadliest genocide in history. Just under 6 million Jews would die, and 5 million others, including ethnic Poles, Soviet POWs, Serbs, Romani, Freemasons, disabled people, Slovenians, gays, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Spanish Republicans. But those aboard the MS St. Louis had high hopes of escaping the oppression and violence already underway in Europe and find refuge in the New World. The passengers had purchased landing certificates and transit visas for a then US-friendly Cuba. Failing that, there was always the immigrant-friendly United States or its goody two-shoes sister nation to the north. The Holocaust would take the lives of millions either way. But if the St. Louis succeeded in its voyage, There would be salvation for 937. But that's not what happened. A poem by Emma Lazarus called The New Colossus is engraved on a bronze plaque and mounted on the Statue of Liberty. The second stanza reads, "Keep ancient lands your storied pomp," cries she with silent lips. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these the homeless tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Captain Gustav Schroeder would soon be counting on this to mean something, but when the ship set sail from Hamburg on May 13, 1939, the passengers were totally unaware that the Cuban president, Federico Laredo Bru, had issued Decree 937 a week prior. The decree retroactively invalidated all recently issued landing certificates. Entry to Cuba would now require written authorization from the Cuban Secretaries of State and Labor, and the posting of a $500 bond. By this time, the Cubans had already accepted about 2,500 Jewish refugees, and many resented the relatively large number of refugees entering the country at this time. Like many countries, Cuba was suffering from the Great Depression, and refugees were seen as competitors for a dwindling number of jobs. Jews were often labeled as communists, and 5 days before the ship departed, Cuba had its largest anti-Semitic demonstration in history, with over 40,000 spectators. A former Cuban president, Grau San Martin, sponsored the rally, where one of his spokesmen, Primitivo Rodriguez, told Cubans to fight the Jews until the last one is driven out. The St. Louis arrived in Havana on May 27th. Only 29 passengers were allowed to disembark, 4 Spanish citizens, 2 Cuban nationals, 22 Jews with valid U.S. visas, and 1 passenger who was brought to hospital after attempting to commit suicide. The remaining 907 refugees would have to go elsewhere. But the St. Louis would find the United States in much the same mood as Cuba. The Great Depression had left millions out of work and fearful of competition with refugees or immigrants. In 1939, the vast majority of Americans opposed joining World War II and opposed relaxing restrictions on immigration. 3 months prior to the voyage of the St. Louis, a bill to allow the admission of 20,000 additional Jewish children from Germany died in committee. Sailing north along Florida's coast, passengers cabled President FDR asking for refuge. He did not respond, but 1 passenger received a message from the State Department instructing them to wait their turns on the waiting list to qualify for entry. Because of immigration quotas established back in 1924, that waiting list was several years long. Behind the scenes, Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, advised President Roosevelt not to accept the Jews. And when Captain Schroeder sailed close to Florida's coastline, Hull instructed the U.S. Coast Guard to follow the ship closely to prevent refugees from jumping ship and swimming ashore. Several other attempts to find refuge in Latin America failed. Then a group of Canadian academics and clergy tried to persuade Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King to allow the passengers safe haven in the Great White North. Chief among their opponents was Frederick Charles Blair, Canada's Director of Immigration, who in a 1938 letter boasted about his careful control of pressure by Jewish people to get into Canada. Mackenzie King sided with Blair, and the St. Louis returned across the Atlantic, finally docking in Belgium on June 17th with all 907 passengers still on board.
The liner St. Louis, turned back from Cuba, brings its human cargo to port at last. 907 Jewish unfortunates without a country, permitted to land in Belgium after 5 weeks of suspense afloat.
The UK agreed to take 288 of the passengers. Those would be the lucky ones, out of reach from Nazi Germany throughout the war. The remaining 619 were accepted by France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The next year, these countries would be occupied by Nazi Germany. An estimated 254 of these refugees died during the Holocaust.
We are honored this morning to have Mrs. Huberta von Voss-Wittig with us today from the German Embassy. Mrs. Huberta von Voss-Wittig is a German journalist, publicist, and book author. After studying political science, history, and the Romanesque in Germany, she worked as a political correspondent for various daily newspapers. She was a member of the German Federal Press Conference and spokeswoman for the president of the German Bundestag, Rita Sussmuth. Mrs. von Voss-Wittig later served as an expert on contemporary history, international politics, and human rights for the German Bundestag. From 1997 through 2002, she accompanied her husband on ambassadorial postings to Beirut. In 2010, Mrs. Wittig moved to the United States. She is currently in the New York City correspondent for the Icon Welt am Sonntag. How's my German? I'm working on it. In 2012, she launched the online petition Letter to Asma, which went viral. Her media appearances include CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, ZDF. Ms. Wittig has lived in D.C. since 2014. She is married to the German ambassador to the United States, Dr. Peter Wittig, and they have 4 children, one of whom is with us here today, and we are honored to have you.
Rabbi Holzblatt, thank you so much for your kind introduction and for inviting me into your temple. It means so much to me to be included in this important ceremony. Ms. Wiener, Dr. Fischer, Mr. Hetfield, dear congregation. It is a tremendous honor for me to speak to you today, and I'm sorry that my husband couldn't make it, but he's sending you his warmest regards. Adas Israel is such a remarkable community. When I came here a few weeks ago to fetch a friend of my daughter, Orly, I got a little lost, and I thought this place is so much more than a temple. It's like a village. What a blessing to have such a place in life. I'm deeply honored to be included in this ceremony to enlarge the garden of the righteous. My husband and I are both firmly committed to keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive and to create meaningful opportunities to learn from survivors. The annual November 9th luncheon at the German Embassy with survivors who serve at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum stands out among the many events that we are hosting. Since we started this series, our table has 4 legs again, and I'm very grateful to all the survivors for breaking bread with us and with students from various schools who come to listen to their story. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are honoring a person who was very unlikely to become a positive force in the darkest period of my country's history. Captain Schroeder was an underweight teen when he left school at the age of 16. Only 72 pounds, not even 5 feet. There was not much that made him particularly capable of commanding a whole crew. Not much but his persistence, dedication, and passion for the sea. Eventually, this made him into an able seaman, reaching the position of a captain with only 24 years, crossing the oceans from India to America. As little as his parents would have expected him to become a successful captain, as little would one have thought him to become a savior for the Jews that left the suppression and harassment of the Nazi regime. He had not been an open or even secret opponent to the Nazi regime. To the contrary, as a captain on boats of Nazi-organized cruises, he praised the social benefits that the Nazis granted to its citizens, gifts that, of course, benefited only those who were still considered German by the Nazi rulers. The 937 passengers who boarded the St. Louis in 1939 were fleeing from a country that had just unleashed the barbarism of the Kristallnacht, the night of broken crystal. They were fleeing from countrymen who turned against them in open, escalating hatred. Despite the imminent threats against their lives, many states, including European neighbor states, as well as the United States, had closed their borders or made it nearly impossible to obtain a visa. When the St. Louis left for Cuba, the passengers were leaving with a mix of hope and fear. What evolved was a haunting tale, as we have seen. Unable to disembark in Cuba, unwanted in the United States, the St. Louis had to return to Europe. Despite despair on board and rising pressure from his bosses, Captain Schroeder did not give up. He refused to go back and to disembark in Germany. He was negotiating and considering to let the ship fake an accident when finally the message arrived. France, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and Belgium would each admit a share of the passengers to their countries. Ladies and gentlemen, some of you might ask, why do we remember men like Captain Schroeder? Why, when the majority of Germans engaged in or stood by the humiliation of neighbors and friends, classmates and colleagues? Why, when Germans tolerated or took part in the Holocaust? We remember him because these stories of courage and integrity, of taking action against inhumanity and evil when others choose indifference, are an example. They are an example for our societies today, and I'm grateful that you reminded us of the atrocities happening in Syria since so many years. We are all so fortunate to live in democracies that protect and guarantee civil rights, but we cannot ever take freedom for granted. Each generation of citizens has to earn freedom and civil rights. We, as parents, have to model vigilance, courage, and civility, because our children need to see who we embrace and who we call out on their behavior or actions. Musicians like Viktor Ullmann kept playing despite or maybe because of Auschwitz. Teachers like Janusz Korczak stayed with their students despite an opportunity to disembark the death train. Viktor Ullmann, Janusz Korczak, and Gustav Schroeder remind us that we are not who we are, but who we choose to be. We are seeing a dramatic rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes and rhetoric all around the world. We have to witness how stereotyping an entire religion and people is happening, not just from the growing new right, but from leaders who should uphold the highest standards of civility. We have to witness new forms of anti-Semitic hatred by Muslim extremists who are questioning the very value we are built upon. Some of them are successful members of our societies, like the two German rappers, Kollega and Farid Bang, who both just won a high award by the music industry despite their disgraceful lyrics. Let me use this opportunity to tell you how disgusted I am by the decision, and I am glad that I am by far not alone in my anger. All of these developments are not a national phenomenon. They can be observed on both sides of the Atlantic, in many countries, in many forms, new and old. All of these attacks target our liberal societies as a whole. They are an attack on the very core of our values. 937 passengers were on board of the St. Louis. Of these 937, 254 died in the Holocaust, and we include each of them in our prayers today and tomorrow. We will hear from two who survived the atrocities, Eva Wiener and Dr. Hans Fischer, and I want to thank them in particular for speaking to us. The actions we are taking now will shape the future we will share. Let me close by quoting from a letter of Ollie's great-grandfather, Karl Wildman, in which he is reflecting on an afternoon where he took a rowing boat instead of a speedboat on a lake that he loved and knew well. We have to stop racing and all that it implies, that there is a future, that tomorrow is more important than today. We have to assign overwhelming importance to the day and to our act, our performance on this day. We have to summon our accumulated experience and our accumulated resources to fashion a day that we can live with delight. Please try. Thank you for having me.
Each of us has a name given by God and given by our parents. Each of us has a name given by our stature and our smile, and given by what we wear. Each of us has a name given by the mountains and given by our walls.
Each of us has a name given by the stars and given by our neighbors. Each of us has a name given by our sins and given by our longing. Each of us has a name given by our enemies and given by our love.
Each of us has a name given by our celebrations and given by our work. Each of us has a name given by the seasons and given by our blindness. Each of us has a name given by the sea and given by our death.
Part of this year's program is to bridge the past and the memory of the past with the future. And it is our next speaker who I think so beautifully represents that, Mark Hetfield, who's the president and CEO of HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Mark was appointed CEO of HIAS after a 25-year career, much of it served at HIAS, most recently as the agency's senior vice president of policy and programs. An expert in refugee and immigration law, policy, and programs, Mark has led HIAS's transformation from an organization focused on Jewish immigrants to a global agency assisting refugees of all faiths and ethnicities. As a result, HIAS currently is a major implementing partner of the United Nations Refugee Agency and the U.S. Department of State, and it is our honor to have Mark with us here this morning.
Thank you, Rabbi Holtzblatt. It really is a great honor to be here today at Addis honoring Captain Schroeder. In 1939, during the voyage of the St. Louis, my agency, HIAS, was already in middle age. We were already a 58-year-old organization. But at that time, even though it was our job to protect refugees and asylum seekers, particularly those who were Jewish, there was no refugee convention to protect them. There was no international law to protect them. The passengers on the St. Louis had only one sovereign authority that was protecting them, and that authority was Captain Schroeder. Now, I used to work at the Immigration and Naturalization Service of blessed memory. It no longer exists, the INS, but one of my mentors there, Joseph Reese, used to say that every time we contemplate a new regulation or a new policy affecting asylum seekers, affecting refugees, we always have to ask the question, would this policy have saved the lives of the passengers of the St. Louis? This was a question that Captain Schroeder had to ask himself every day during that voyage. Now, we are really blessed today to have Dr. Hans Fischer and Eva Wiener to tell their stories as passengers. And there's another passenger I want to talk about, not to tell her story, but to make a point about how important Captain Schroeder was. Now, her name was Ilsa Marcus. She died in 2006 after living for nearly 60 years in Washington Heights in New York. Now, Ilsa twice saw the shore of America. The first time was in June of 1939 on the deck of the SS St. Louis when she was traveling with her husband, her brother, her mother, and her father when they stared at the lights of Miami. The second time that Ilsa saw the shore of America was after the war. That time, she was alone. Between those two sightings, Ilsa's father, who had been returned on the St. Louis, along with the rest of the family, was deported to Poland, where he perished. Ilsa, her husband, her mother, and her brother were all sent to Auschwitz. All of them, except Ilsa, were murdered in the gas chamber. Ilsa survived. The second time Ilsa saw the coast of America, she did not see the lights of Miami. This time, she was in New York Harbor and saw the Statue of Liberty. But she was unmoved. She said, "The Statue of Liberty means nothing to me. When we were here on the St. Louis, pleading for deliverance from evil, she sent us away. Her tablet says, 'Give me your huddled masses yearning to breathe free.' We were not a mass. We were just a little over 900 souls on the St. Louis. And more than yearning to breathe free, we were just yearning to breathe. We were just yearning to survive." Ilsa said, to send the St. Louis back to Europe was a criminal act. That's where Ilsa was wrong. In 1939, it was not a criminal act to send the St. Louis back to Europe. And in fact, it wasn't just sent back to Europe, as you know. When it was turned around, first from Havana and then from Miami, it wasn't being sent to Belgium, it was being sent back to Germany. There was no law, there was no treaty to prevent that from happening. There was just one brave man who had legal authority over that ship and those passengers, and that was Captain Schroeder. Now, he had shown other acts of bravery on board that ship. There's a famous story about how in the grand ballroom of the ship there was a large portrait of Adolf Hitler, and Captain Schroeder, to his own great risk, ordered his crew to take down the portrait because he knew it was making the passengers very uncomfortable. Now, Captain Schroeder, as the sovereign authority on that ship, did everything he could to protect the passengers on that ship, did everything he could to delay their return to Germany when no one else would take them. After arriving in Havana on May 27th, he stayed there until June 2nd, trying to find a solution for the passengers. He then circled the island of Cuba repeatedly, then finally went to Florida and went up and down the coast from June 3rd to June 5th, hoping that the United States and President Roosevelt would respond to the requests for asylum. He then, when he was to take the ship back to Germany, did his best to take the slowest, most circuitous route he could, while other solutions were sought. And then finally, on June 10th, a solution was found. We know that it was an ill-fated solution, but still, the refugees were not going to be returned to Nazi Germany, but to other parts of Europe. Now, ultimately, 254 of those passengers perished in the Holocaust. That could have been prevented, of course, had Cuba or the United States or Canada accepted the passengers. But it does leave us with a lot of valuable lessons. We have spent, the international community spent, all the years after the war, building up treaties and laws and institutions to make sure that never again would people who fled for their lives be returned to their persecutors. Today, we see those institutions under grave threat, frankly. And we have to do our best and ask ourselves, when we see our asylum laws being eroded, when we see refugees not being able to find protection or refuge, when we see countries refusing to share the burden, to share responsibility for the 23 million refugees in the world, we have to ask ourselves, what would Captain Schroeder do? Thank you.
Der Nebech läuft wie von Feier, der Schloden nun schrecklich verwirrt. Sie sucht vor Not, keine Not mehr freier, ihr Heim ist zerbrochen, ruiniert. Weggeräumt hat man ihr ganzen Vermögen, gelassen in Elend und Not. An neue Heim sucht sie, ihr Kopf wo zu legen und wo zu verdienen auf Brot. Sie sucht zu beschützen ihr armen Leben und Tränen vergisst sie a Teich. Sie weiß, in Amerika sind gegeben die Rechten für alle Men gleich. Mit Zorys erschluckt sie sich gar ohne Breg. Da kommt Ellis Eiland und geht sie auf Reg. Sie kennst du a Sprach, sie hast du a Fach, sie bringst du nicht Geld mit a Sach. Der jeden Welt, nein, dann heißt wenn sie gehen. Oh, Ellis Eiland, die Grenze von Freiland, wie grausam und schrecklich du bist. Selche Ziches, das kennen noch Riches. Du plockst die Geplagte siehst. Mit Zornes gekommen, dem Jam kaum geschwommen, die Gärten von Freiheit der Sehn. Da kommt Ellis Eiland, die Grenze von Freiland, und sagt, halt, du kennst weiter nicht gehen.
Good morning. In September 2012, the State Department issued an apology to the St. Louis passengers for failing to allow them to come to the United States and disembark. At the conclusion of the formal program in which both our speakers participated, State Department staff and Foreign Service officers asked the passengers repeatedly why they sought to come to the United States even after their terrible experience. The answer often offered then, as I suspect it is offered even now by refugees seeking admittance, was that despite what the government had done, it was still a country where they had the greatest hope for a bright future. As those survivors pointed to their own accomplishments and their families, not only were they right, but it is also the greatest statement of defiance to Hitler and others like him who sought to destroy us for being Jews. My family and I are particularly grateful to Captain Schroeder's bravery because it enabled my father and his mother and sister ultimately to reunite with his father in Cuba and eventually emigrate to America. I am pleased to introduce my father, Dr. Hans Fischer, who will share his recollections of Captain Schroeder and the ship from his perspective of an 11-year-old who had escaped Germany, hoping to be reunited with his father, and eventually doing so after spending several months in France. Dad.
Good morning. I'm glad that you are here and that we have this wonderful opportunity to recount what happened in 1939 in relation to the ship, the St. Louis. Captain Schroeder was indeed an unusual individual. There's very little that I can add to what has already been said. Let me just recount it again. First of all, he told the crew members, some of whom were members of the Nazi Party, that they had to behave, that they had to treat all passengers as though they were elite passengers, and they indeed did that. We were treated very, very well. Secondly, as you heard before, he made sure that Hitler's portrait was taken off the wall. Thirdly, he made it possible to have religious services. Perhaps most importantly of all, he met on a regular basis and on the way back probably almost every day with the committee of passengers that had formed to look into what might be possible to ensure a safe fate for all of us. I think it was in 1995, there was a meeting in Miami of passengers from the St. Louis, and to this event, Captain Schroeder's nephew came, and you all have this program, and he brought to that event the cap that Captain Schroeder always wore. And that cap was one of the items that we, the surviving passengers, sent to Yad Vashem together with letters recommending that Yad Vashem name Captain Schroeder one of the righteous, which they did, as you heard before, in 1997. As you also heard from one of the earlier speakers, many, perhaps most of the passengers ended up on the St. Louis as a result of Kristallnacht, which, as you probably recall, took place on November 9th and 10th of 1938. My father was picked up, taken to Buchenwald, but because he was a veteran of World War I, fighting for Germany, for the fatherland, a lawyer friend was able to get him released in January of 1939 with the proviso that he leave within 2 weeks. And this same lawyer friend got him a visa, actually first to Panama, and he left on January 19th for New York, and in New York he exchanged that visa to go to Cuba instead. And then my mother, my sister, and I left on the St. Louis. We wanted to leave earlier, but I came down with scarlet fever, and in the days before antibiotics, it took a long time for me to recover, and so we were only able to leave in May on the St. Louis. As my daughter just told you, when we were at the State Department event, one young lady specifically asked me, "How do you feel coming to this country that did all this to you back in 1939? And my answer to her was, you know, it wasn't this country. This country, that's an objective term. It was people who did these things. And so I want to just mention a couple of events in which I was involved. I was born in Germany in a city called Breslau, now Wrocław, Poland, and we took a train to Hamburg from which the St. Louis left, and we arrived there 2 days before the ship left. The ship left on Saturday the 13th, and we got there on the 11th. And the first thing that we did, we being my mother, my sister stayed with this lawyer friend of my father's, and I accompanied my mother, and we went to the Cuban consulate to pick up these ill-fated permits for which we paid a lot of money. And my mother received them, placed them in our passports, and as we moved towards the exit of the consulate, there was a little table and there was a young lady sitting behind that table. And as we got close to her, she spoke up and said, "Madam, would you like me to print a visa into your passport?" My mother was taken aback and didn't really quite know what to do. And then after some seconds had passed, she said, "Well, thank you very much, but I really don't think we need that. We just picked up these permits and we left." Who knows, we were later told that if we had had these visas, we would have been let in. Of course, I don't believe that for 1 minute, because if everybody had gotten these visas, they would have had to let everybody in. So I'm not sure that that is correct, but I just want to point out how little human actions, just as Captain Schroeder's positive and wonderful actions, negative actions also had an effect. In this regard, I want to mention one other thing. It's been mentioned several times that 22 Jewish passengers were permitted to leave the St. Louis. What has not been mentioned, and what you really should know, is that if you knew the right person or had the nice relationship to some person, that helped. Those 22 Jewish passengers who were let in were either relatives or friends of Walter Annenberg. Walter Annenberg was the publisher of the Philadelphia Inquirer, later ambassador to Great Britain. In other words, a very prominent person in the United States. And even though it says in the brochure or someplace else that these 22 passengers had the right certificates or documents, the truth really is that they were friends or relatives of Annenberg. I don't think they had any different documents than any of the rest of us. I want to mention that my mother, my sister, and I ended up in France when the ship went back, landed in Antwerp, and we were transshipped, put on another boat that went to France, and ended up in a small town called Laval, 300 miles west of Paris. It was a truly medieval town. I want to mention again, people. One day a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage, pulled up in front of the place where we stayed, and the liveryman, who was a driver of this carriage, asked for Madame Fischer, and my mother spoke some French, and he told her that his boss, who was the owner of an estate nearby, wanted to invite her and my sister and me for tea at an early convenience. And they arranged to have us picked up the following week. And we were picked up by the same individual with the carriage, and we got to this beautiful estate and were ushered into a very wonderful old castle, into a living room, and an elderly gentleman greeted us very nicely. We were seated, and he said to us that he invited us because the local priest had for many years told his parishioners that Jews had horns on their forehead. And he had never met a Jewish person before, and when he heard that there were several Jewish people in Laval, he had wanted to meet one or more to see if this was really true. Just for those of you who may not know the origin of this story about horns, it is a mistranslation of a Hebrew word, karneh. When Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, it says that his forehead lit up and shone brightly. And the word for shining brightly is a very similar word to the word for horn. And that mistranslation has often been cited. But it's interesting that, again, this gentleman was curious. He didn't quite believe the priest, and so he wanted to find out for himself. So I want to conclude again by saying that it's people who carry out actions for good or for evil, and we are lucky that there was a man such as Captain Schroeder who ultimately made it possible, together with other good people. I must mention a man by the name of Trevor Roper, who was the joint distribution individual who had negotiated with Belgium, France, England, and Holland to make it possible for us passengers to get into those countries when the ship came back. So thank you for coming and listening.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. It's so moving for us to live that experience through your eyes. Thank you all for being here. This Garden of the Righteous program that we have each year here at Addis, Israel, links each of us to our irrefutable past. Just as importantly, through this program, we renew our commitment to tell this story again and again, so that each generation hears the story again and again, and eventually learns it, please God. No one exemplifies this commitment more than our next speaker, Eva Saphir Wiener. She was the youngest girl on the St. Louis, a 10-month-old little baby. It was her mother's unrelenting efforts to get her family out of Germany and her father's innate wisdom to get the family into England that account for Mrs. Wiener's being with us today. She understands that as a passenger on this ship, she's empowered and indeed obligated to relate the story of the St. Louis and its remarkable captain. She speaks primarily with school children, teaching them the importance of respecting other people, no matter who they are or what they look like or what their names are, to stand up against bigotry and racism and anti-Semitism and bullying, and to learn the lessons of the Holocaust so they can teach them to others. We're grateful and honored to have you with us today, Mrs. Wiener. Thank you for telling us your story.
Thank you. I'm honored to have been invited here today. and Hans, you're difficult to follow. As was said, I was only a baby on the ship. But in truth, my parents shared with me the story of the St. Louis, for which I really did not know its significance. It was just a story my parents told me. Yeah, we went to Cuba, then we went to England. I couldn't understand why we had no family in England. There was nobody around other than friends. So my mother explained how and why the process evolved. Only when the book, Voyage of the Damned, and the film that followed it, did I realize that I was part of history that had significance. And because of this significance in the evolvement of World War II, I felt now that I had a message that I could share, especially with children, of what bigotry and hate and discrimination and anti-Semitism, if not contained and not combated, can evolve and, God forbid, happen again. Of course, we know that genocides are still happening today. And this is one of the reasons I feel that the story of the St. Louis is so important. And yes, the captain is a very intricate part of that story. I remember my mother telling me that she heard the captain promise the passengers not to bring them back to Germany because he knew what their fate was going to be. And as I remember her saying, he wanted to beach the ship in Scotland rather than bring his passengers back to Germany where their fate was foretold. She made me understand how the captain was truly the savior of the passengers. And yes, my father was an extremely insightful man. Little did he know that his choice of going to England would be our savior. He wanted that English Channel as a buffer between him and Germany. And he said he wanted to get as far away from Germany as conceivably possible, and that would be to England. And that surprised me because I knew that when we landed in Antwerp, my father's sister, brother-in-law, and their baby was standing on the dock to greet us. And I often asked him, why didn't you choose Belgium? I mean, after all, you did have family there. He said, it didn't matter. Just wanted to get away from Germany. That, to him, was the most important thing, which inevitably is what really rescued us. Living in England, in London particularly, during the war, was far from pleasant, considering the fact that the Germans bombed us nearly nightly. We spent many hours and days in what they call bomb shelters, sometimes in little Quonset huts in the back of the apartment that we lived in. But nothing that I experienced could possibly compare to what it would have been had we gone to any of the other 3 countries. So I'm very grateful that my father chose to be put on the list for England. We also arrived in America for the second time. We arrived on Memorial Day weekend into New York Harbor, where there was a dock strike, and we couldn't get off the ship. It was a little frightening. But dock strikes were very common in those days, and fortunately it was resolved at the end of the weekend, and we were able to disembark. But for a while there, it was a little scary. But I'm very grateful that my parents shared with me their experiences and their feelings and their emotions that brought them to the St. Louis, which, by the way, was done in a very roundabout way. My father had been shipped to Warsaw, Poland. They were shipping men not only to concentration camps, but also to what's called country of origin, and my father had been born in Poland. He was permitted to come back to Berlin because my mother was able to get a visa to Siam. Now, when I speak to kids, they don't know what Siam is. And many of you, I'm sure, have never heard of it either, except maybe in The King of Siam. So I explained to them that Thailand, all the way over there in the Far East, is a very backward country, not very modern, probably no indoor plumbing. But she also had a brother who had emigrated to Cuba. My mother had sent him money to buy us our landing permits, which, by the way, I have the original document that my father saved that eventually became worthless. So my father was able to come back to Berlin. In the meantime, we got the visa for Cuba. Well, overjoyed, my mother booked the passage on the St. Louis. And my father came back. Within 2 weeks, we were on a train to Hamburg. And what my mother used to say was it was a very, very joyous time. It was a festive, magnificent ship. And there were banners flying on the deck, and there was a band playing, and photographers running around all over the place. The photographers were taking photos of all the passengers. And we learned later that that was all part of the Nazi propaganda plot to show these photographs as postcards and have them sent to friends and family throughout the world to show them what a wonderful time we were having and how magnanimous the German government was in letting us go on this beautiful cruise ship. Later to find out that this was decided as a ploy to show the world that eventually nobody would want us and they could do the world a favor by eliminating us. Many lessons were learned many years after the war to what we were simply chess pieces in a giant chess game that the propaganda machine had created. And kids ask me the same question: why did you come back to America after what we did to you the first time? And my answer simply is 1946 was not the same country that the United States was in 1939. And having come the second time, I'm grateful that I was given the opportunity in America for education, for earning a living, for practicing my Judaism, and being able to have a wonderful family and really thrive here in the United States. Thank you very much.
In a moment, I'm going to ask you to rise for the El Malei Rachamim prayer. Immediately following this prayer, we're going to proceed outside. I believe that the rain has held off for us. We're going to go right onto the patio out the back doors, and we will unveil a beautiful plaque for Captain Gustav Schroeder. Just a few other quick announcements. At 2:30, the JCRC will be holding a Yom HaShoah program, Hate and the Holocaust, at Temple Beth Ami today. And the last announcement is that if you haven't been to the reflective pool down in the mall, there is an incredible exhibit called Lest We Forget. I believe it is only up for another week. It is a joint project between the German Embassy and the Holocaust Museum, and it displays incredible photographs of survivors. So make sure you make your way down there. Please rise.
נשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל שנטבחו בשואה, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם. בעל הרחמים, הסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר אמן.
Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure to the souls of all of our brethren who perished in the Shoah, men, women, and children of the house of Israel, who were slaughtered, suffocated, and burned to ashes. May their memory endure and inspire deeds of charity and goodness in our lives. May their souls thus be bound up in the bond of life. May they rest in peace, and let us say, Amen. Please join us out on the patio.